Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Wishing a very sacred and special Holy Week for everybody to internalize the teachings of Mar Yeshua and the extent to which he was willing to go to share his transformative teachings with the world, past, present, and future. This is part 30 of a series. So now we're ahead of the traditional church schedule. In many Orthodox churches, they celebrate Palm Sunday today, which is the day when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, which we covered many weeks back already in our discussions in the Gospel of Mark. Today we'll continue with the discussion of Jesus on his way to be crucified. So in Mark 15, 21 through 24, they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross, Jesus' cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. So here we have gone past the point where Jesus was arrested. He was tried by the Sanhedrin. He was tried by Pontius Pilate, the governor of that area of the Roman Empire. And now he was already tortured. He already had the crown of thorns put on him. He was mocked by having a purple robe put over him in the style of kings. And now Jesus is off on a procession through Jerusalem to show everybody what happens if you go against the powers that be. If you go against tradition of the temple establishment. If you are believed by the Roman occupancy to be someone who might cause sedition or insurrection within the Roman Empire, this is what happens to you. You will be arrested, you will be beaten, you will be scourged, and you'll be mocked in a procession throughout Jerusalem up to Golgotha, where you'll be put on display and crucified. So Jesus was crucified because they thought he might create a rebellion. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is called the Son of David, meaning the Davidic Messiah. The Davidic Messiah was thought to be somebody that would come to the bloodline of King David, of Hebrew Testament fame. He would conquer all opposition to Israel and the Jewish people, and he would establish a new Jerusalem, a new world capital from which he would rule and restore Judaism for the Jewish people. But not only would the Davidic Messiah rule over Jews, he would rule over everyone and conquer all opposition, which would include the Roman occupancy. Jesus did not believe that he was the Davidic Messiah. He did not. We know this from the Gospel of Mark, where he satirized the Davidic Messiah. Jesus taught the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. This communion of saints, we could rebirth ourselves from the old Adam, a selfish humanity concerned only about its own needs, and be rebirthed into a spiritualized new humanity. And this was called the Bar Anash in Aramaic. It is a collective idea taught in ancient Jewish sources that is rooted in the Babylonian Jewish tradition. In books such as the Book of Daniel, Book of Enoch, books of Isaiah, and other sources as well. So Jesus did not believe himself to be the Davidic Messiah, but many people in the area of Jerusalem thought he was. There were many Jewish expectations of what Messiah would be. Some believed one type of Messiah would come. Others believed a different kind of Messiah would come. Some believed multiple Messiahs would come. And some Jews believe that no Messiah will come. So there's a wide range of messianic expectation. But the Judean expectation of Messiah was predominantly that of the Davidic Messiah. That a son of David, a biological heir of King David, would come and restore Israel both politically and religiously. And that all opposition to both the political and religious interests of Israel would be defeated by this Davidic Messiah. And it seems that many people thought Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. Jesus began to preach a renewed covenant with God, one not based in the letter of the law and priestly sacrifices from the Second Temple, but one that put personal responsibility on us to transform our thoughts, our words, and deeds from predominantly selfish thoughts, words, and deeds to selfless thoughts, words, and deeds. He taught that this alone, in addition to observing Torah from a heart perspective, would cause a spiritual rebirth, rebirthing us from our spiritual inheritance in the original Adam, or the first Adam, into this second Adam, called the Baranash, this second humanity. Because Adam doesn't mean one man. Adam means humanity. So the first humanity is a humanity that is more focused on itself, its needs. And the second Adam, the second humanity, or the Baranash, son of mankind Messiah, son of man Messiah, was a spiritualized, purified, sanctified humanity. One person at a time will follow Jesus' teachings and become purified. When Jesus taught this, it automatically caused animosity between himself and the Second Temple. And from the earliest parts of the gospel, they were chasing him, trying to arrest him, planning on what they should do with him, how they should kill him, because he was a celebrity, a spiritual celebrity in the streets. People were listening to them. People were turning away from ancient temple traditions to follow this man. So whether the temple establishment believed Jesus to be the Davidic Messiah or not, they threw him under the bus to the Roman occupancy and said, hey, this guy is causing us lots of problems. And a lot of people in Jerusalem think he's the Davidic Messiah. Do you really want a rebellion? You better arrest him and erase him. And that's why Jesus was killed. There are lots of anti-Semitic beliefs throughout church history saying all the Jews killed Jesus. No. All the Jews did not kill Jesus. The temple establishment that feared Jesus' spiritual eminence and his teachings, which were much more evolved than theirs, they wanted to get rid of him. Because many priesthoods rake in a lot of money doing sacrifices or prayers to take away the sins and limitations of people. When Jesus said, you could do this yourself. You can purify yourself. You can move towards union with God consciously through my walk, my gait, my halakha, the way I walk life. If you do this, you can come into communion, into oneness with God. And the temple establishment did not want that. So they stirred up problems with the Roman occupancy, with Pontius Pilate, and said, he is seditious. He's a traitor to the Roman Empire. He wants people to believe that he is the King of the Jews, the Davidic Messiah, the one that will put the Roman Empire out of business. And Jesus never said this. We've covered it amply throughout these talks on the book of Mark. And we'll say it again and again and again into the future because it's been engrounded into human consciousness erroneously for 2 millennia. But again, whether the Jewish temple establishment believed Jesus to be the Davidic Messiah or not, we imagine that they did not believe that, even though Jesus didn't preach the Davidic Messiah. He was charged for being a fake Davidic Messiah, one that could potentially cause a rebellion or an insurrection against the Roman occupancy. And that's why Pontius Pilate ultimately executed him. So here it's very interesting, as the Gospels begin to grow in number. Mark was the first Gospel, followed by Matthew, Luke, and then John. We see different stories. Here in the book of Mark, Jesus never carried his cross. He was just led in a procession from wherever he was at with Pontius Pilate to Golgotha, the place of the skull where he was crucified. And the whole time, it never talks about the fact that Jesus fell or that Jesus carried his own cross or anything. That was developed in later Christian literature. In Mark, we only see Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross. He was conscripted to carry the cross for Jesus to Golgotha, as seen in this picture. It's really interesting because they say they divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide which each should take. So the Roman soldiers, after they had tortured him and prepared him to go on this trek to Golgotha to be crucified, they divided his clothes. And as we discussed last week, this is probably not historical. Why is it not historical? Why do I say that? The reason is that nobody was with Jesus. Nobody was with Jesus. Nobody saw what happened behind closed doors. Nobody saw the Sanhedrin trial. Nobody saw what was privately said between he and Pontius Pilate. And none of the disciples saw Jesus being tortured and them casting lots. The whole idea of Jesus' passion narrative, from the time he was arrested until the time that he died on the cross, that was predominantly developed from a cherry-picked psalm, Psalm 22. And we're going to look at that today too. So Psalm 22 describes the story of Jesus in exact terms. And some Orthodox Christians will say, oh, well, Jesus' life fulfilled those scriptures. It didn't. The Psalms were about King David's life and his interaction with God, his struggles with God, and being the king and leader of the Jewish people. They were not about Jesus. None of the prophecies of Isaiah or any other prophet were about Jesus. The great prophets prophesied about things happening in their lifetime. A prophet prophesies for the people that are living during that time. So all these things that are in fulfillment of the scriptures, so to speak, are non-historical. And they also do not fit into the Jewish perspective of things, into the Judean perspective. They are very convenient things. So because nobody knew what happened in Jesus' trial, because nobody knew what happened between he and Pontius Pilate behind closed doors, because nobody knew what happened when he was taken away from Pontius Pilate, when he was purportedly abused, etc. And no doubt he was abused. No doubt he was tortured. But we don't know what happened. There were no eyewitnesses there. There are no security cameras. So as early Christianity developed, they tried to find ways of filling in that story with the Hebrew Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And in this case, the whole Passion narrative was plagiarized a lot from Psalm 22. We'll look at it in a moment and you'll see what we mean. So just remember, they divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. That is not historical. So in Mark 15:25 through 32, it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified Jesus. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, the Messiah ben David, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. So here again we see that the crime that Jesus was charged with and executed for was insurrection. The Jewish temple establishment claimed that Jesus claimed he was the King of the Jews, the Davidic Messiah, which is not true. Jesus taught the Son of Man Messiah. But they twisted the story to get him captured for insurrection, for being a traitor to the Roman governance. And they crucified him in a lowly fashion to ridicule him between two bandits. And those two bandits even taunted him. And they said, "If you're something special, if you're this great man of God, save yourself." And the chief priests who saw so many miracles happen, so many healings, said he saved others, but he cannot save himself. So he was being mocked. Again, Psalm 22 talks about the fact that the author was mocked and derided and that people shook their heads at him. So that part may have gone into this to elaborate on the Passion narrative, but things like this seem more possible, more historical. Mark 15:33 through 39. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filling a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come down to take him." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." So here we see, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This directly comes from Psalm 22. Was it historical? Maybe. We have to remember that Jesus was a very faithful Jew. He was a Jewish Rav, a Jewish master. He would have been very well versed with Psalm 22 and many other psalms. Maybe that was a psalm that was close to his heart. And maybe he called this prayer out in his pain. It's possible. But when you're in intense pain, you're probably not going to be quoting scripture. So again, it seems that this part of the Passion narrative was also taken from Psalm 22. My living spiritual master, one day, I was in India with her, and many of her other disciples, and she was doing a question and answer session. And somebody asked her, "Why did Jesus say this line, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If he was God, or if he was one with God, or if he was a great spiritual master in communion with God, how could he ever feel separation from God? How could he ever feel forsaken by God? No matter which one of these philosophies, theories, or dogmas one associates him or herself with, how could Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And my teacher at first said, "I don't want to create any spiritual divisions or spiritual frictions." But the man kept on persisting. And finally, my living spiritual master, she said, "He never said that. He never said that." No great spiritual master in communion with God, illumined by God, could ever think for even a moment that they are separated from God. He never said that. And then she continued and she said, we have to remember that Jesus did not write the Gospels. His disciples did. And his disciples, according to my spiritual master's perspective, I'm not saying this is historical, I'm just giving a different perspective. She said that those writers put those words into Jesus' mouth so that when we read the scriptures millennia later and we're going through painful situations, we are given a model as to how to call on God for help. In other words, Jesus never said this. Psalm 22 said it. But according to my spiritual master, the writers of the Gospel of Mark, she gave them a more noble purpose than what might be construed from this conversation about Psalm 22 that we had last week and this week. What she is saying is that by putting these words of Psalm 22 into the mouth of Jesus, Jesus is the model to follow when we suffer, when we're in pain, when we're having difficulties in life. Jesus is being modeled. He's modeling how to call on God when we feel like God has abandoned us, when we feel like we're all alone. It teaches us that in the worst of circumstances, we should call on God, cling to God with all of our fervor. But here, when Jesus calls Eloi, Eloi, God, God, my God, the people hearing him misheard him and they thought that he was calling for Elijah. And this is something that I've never heard an Orthodox Christian church explain in any sermon. Listen, he's calling for Elijah. Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. What the heck are they talking about? Elijah is a prophet from ancient days. He's long dead. He is not alive at the time of Jesus. Elijah was a different messianic expectation. Just like there was the idea of the Davidic Messiah coming to reestablish and restore political and religious Israel. And then there is the Messiah ben Joseph, the great teacher who would die for teaching truth. And he would rise from the sea. That was a different messianic expectation. There are priestly messianic expectations that descended from Aaron. None of these the Christian church teaches us. They only teach us that there's one Messiah. It's the Davidic Messiah, and that was Jesus. They don't talk about the rest. They don't talk about what's right here in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark was aware that there was a messianic expectation that in the end days, when there would be the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, in which there would be a kind of judgment day, that one messianic expectation is that Elijah would come. He would come again. So they thought he was praying for Elijah to descend from where? From the clouds and save him? But instead of Elijah's magnificent descent from the clouds, like Christians believe that the Davidic Messiah, the second coming of Jesus, will come from the clouds, instead Jesus cried out loud in pain and died. Earlier in the Gospel of Mark, and mimicked in other later Gospels, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do they, the people, say I am?" And one of the things that people said that they thought Jesus was is they thought he was Elijah. They thought he was the reincarnation of Elijah. They thought that he was some kind of spiritually descended from the heavens Elijah. So many people thought, because Jesus was so spiritually eminent and spiritually powerful and spiritually magnetic, many people thought that he was either the reincarnation or the spiritual descent or whatever of Elijah. And Jesus said, no, Elijah already came. He came in the form of John the Baptist. For those that have eyes to see and ears to hear. So Jesus believed in reincarnation because Jesus felt that Elijah had come again, was reincarnated in the form of John the Baptist. I'm not teaching something new, something extraordinary. It's right there in the gospel. Just read Mark and read Matthew. Read it. If you read it directly and you don't try to contort it, that's exactly what Jesus said. So according to Jesus' belief, he believed that Elijah had already come in the form of John the Baptist. So he wasn't calling on John the Baptist to come down again and save him from the cross. They misheard him. He was saying, my God, Eloi, Eloi, why have you forsaken me?" And when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And because of this, a centurion, a Roman soldier, said, truly this man was God's son. Yeah. It's unlikely that this last statement is true. It's veiled anti-Semitism. The Jews have rejected Jesus. They crucified him. But it is the Roman, the Gentile, that recognizes Jesus as God's son. And notice that it's very specific here. This man was God's son, not the Son of God, which is a Jewish epithet, honorary of a Jewish saint. But here it's actually saying he is God's son. God inseminated Mary, or whatever, and he became that. It seems that's the way it's going. But if you remember in the book of Mark, and that's what most Orthodox Christians think that this means, that this somehow proves that Jesus was God's son because God rejected the Jews by destroying their temple at the time of Jesus' death. But we have to remember that in the Gospel of Mark, there was no virgin birth story. So in the Markan narrative, there's something called adoptionism, that Jesus somehow was adopted by God at his baptism, and that made him God's son. But in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus was not born of a virgin. It was not overtly said that he was God's biological son because God inseminated Mary. Here they're saying this is God's son because God has adopted him. And I believe that it's probably non-historical that this wasn't said. You have to remember all the Roman soldiers they're executing him for treason, for sedition, for insurrection, for potentially causing a rebellion. They didn't care about this lowly guy they were crucifying. They had no interest in what Jesus was teaching and what the Second Temple was teaching. Zero. So this was put here as a veiled anti-Semitic statement. The Jews have rejected Jesus, and the Gentiles are now accepting Jesus. And Jesus is God's son. Well, God must have been on Jesus' side because the temple curtain was torn down. Maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. In verse 15:33, it says, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. This takes us back to Friday, April 3rd, 33 AD. That's when the last eclipse happened. So a solar eclipse happened that gives us the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion, which I have to check my notes. I'm just saying it off the top of my head. It was either April 3rd or 4th, 33 AD. And the 3rd is what sticks out in my mind. So that was the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion. We know it because we have astronomical programs and astrological programs that can mathematically determine when solar and lunar eclipses happen. And the solar eclipse that matches Jesus' timeline was April 3rd, 33 AD. And that is the Friday on which Jesus was crucified. So there was a solar eclipse, and this detail that is also in the epistles of Paul lets us know the likely historical date of Jesus' crucifixion. We don't know when he was born. We don't know where he was born. We don't know much of the details of his life, but we do know when he died, based off the fact that they describe a solar eclipse here and in the Pauline letters. And again, the only mathematical solar eclipse that occurred during the timeline of Jesus' life and what we know of Jesus' life and what is talked about and taught about Jesus' life is a solar eclipse that occurred on April 3rd, 33 AD, which was a Friday. So faithful to the end, Mark 15, 40 through 41. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So here, 3 women are named as being relatively close to Jesus as he died on the cross. Mary Magdalene, who was Jesus' prime and foremost disciple. Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. Who's this Mary? That's none other than Mary, the mother of Jesus, cloaked in Scripture, because there are so many Marys, so many James, so many Johns, that they all become conflated with each other. Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome. This was Mother Mary with the siblings of Jesus. So often in Orthodox Christianity, we don't talk about Jesus' siblings. Yeah. But there were other siblings of Jesus. Mary did have many biological children. So, and it speaks to the fact that many other women came with Jesus on this procession, with Simon carrying his cross from wherever he was held and imprisoned to Golgotha. Notice here in the Gospel of John, we see that John was with the Marys, and that there were other Marys also there. So in this earliest version of the Gospel, because Mark is the origin story of Jesus, the others built off of Mark and got other stories and teachings of Jesus from other Jesus traditions developing after the crucifixion event. Here we see only women here. And it makes sense why. Again, we talked about in the last 2 sessions, our last 2 Eucharists, during the Chalice talk, we spoke about the fact that Jesus encouraged his disciples to run away. He encouraged them to get away from the center of the hurricane, because any disciple teaching Jesus' teachings could also create an uprising, a rebellion amongst the Jews. They would have all been arrested and executed, and then we wouldn't know anything about Jesus' teachings today. It's for the same reason that there were only women near Jesus in the end. Women were seen as not a threat. Men could fight, right? Women can't fight. It's a very patriarchal viewpoint, but it was true of the time. Women could come close to Jesus to comfort him without being arrested or harmed, because they were seen as being insignificant. If any of the male disciples would have come near, they would have been arrested. There would have been a fear that maybe they would draw swords or create some kind of uprising. So the men could not be near Jesus unless they be arrested and executed with Jesus, and thus terminating. Then we wouldn't know Jesus' teachings, because they wouldn't have been passed down to us. Or perhaps a whole other version would have come down to us through Mary Magdalene, who was an apostle and had an apostolic tradition. which is historical, suppressed by Orthodox Christianity, but historical. So again, the male disciples weren't cowards. They followed the instructions of their master to get away, stay away, preserve and teach the gospel. And the women could stay near to Jesus and give him some comfort as he passed on the cross. So the burial is described in Mark 15:42 through 47. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, which would be Friday, that is the day before Sabbath, which is Saturday, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, also the mother of Jesus, saw where the body was laid. So notice there's a lot of things here. You know, in later Gospels, you have the whole spear incident where they speared into Jesus's ribs. They pierced his lungs, and out came water, etc. Because crucifixion does cause essential drowning. It's a very painful and torturous way to kill somebody. That wasn't part of the book of Mark or the Gospel of Mark. He just died from being suspended on the cross, likely from suffocation, from inward drowning of the lungs, as well as any pressure on his body, on other bodily organs from being suspended on the cross. So Joseph of Arimathea was a very wealthy man, and he is a respected member of the council. So he was also expecting the kingdom of God, the sovereignty of God, promised through Jesus' teachings. And because he was so important in Roman life, he was able to ask Pilate for the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted that to him. And then Joseph buried him before the Sabbath, which was very customary. And then next week we'll deal with what Mary Magdalene found, his prime disciple of Jesus found on Easter morning. Let us continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.